Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm truly excited to have you with us today for a critical conversation on from resume to retention, safeguarding employee data in every step. I am joined by my friend and esteemed privacy and GRC leader, Partha Chakravarty. Partha, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Sahu, for having me here. It's an honor and a great opportunity to be exchanging my thoughts and learnings on this particular topic. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all my friends and colleagues who have joined this podcast. So, yeah, looking forward to share my perspective along with you and also learn new perspectives as well.
Thank you, Partha. We all know privacy matters, and privacy is essential. I can say privacy is super duper essential. Even why employee data matters. So think about it. When someone applies for a job, they entrust an organization with incredible sensitive personal data, like your personal identification, your IDs, your educational background, your address, your finance information, maybe even health details. And that is the beginning. What do you say, Partha?
Exactly, Dr. Sahu. In fact, with HR being the first touch point for a particular individual to be able to have that or build that relationship or attempting to build that relationship with an organization, it is extremely crucial for the HR team to be able to provide that space or an environment where even a job applicant, if they're applying for for an open position, they're able to appreciate in a very simple and easy to understand manner that while they are applying whatever personal data they are providing to the organization for the organization to kind of assess their fitment to the role is something that they truly the organization needs, and it would be not just protected but it would really be used, because at the end of the day that's the first touch point. And of course then thereafter the entire employee data life cycle and the various HR processes, right from sourcing to selection to onboarding to their performance management, grievance redressal, and all of that, and right to the retirement or to the termination, be it voluntary or involuntary, will set in. But as you rightly said, HR is the first touch point, and I think it's a matter of great reputational stake and also trust enabler perspective that needs to be kept into mind while thinking about those processes. HR does this job day in and day out, so of course it is not that HR is not aware of it. I've seen organizations with of various maturity, but at the same time we also have to understand that they have a job to do, and of course they are specialists in their job. So it is also a kind of an opportunity for data privacy professionals to be able to partner, not in a policing mode, but to be able to partner with the HR teams to see, okay, how can we really make HR programs or HR processes much more agile, much more innovative, while building these guardrails around privacy, something which is also acceptable from a user perspective. So that's my perspective and that's my take on it, Dr. Sahu.
Absolutely. I think you touch upon trust, right? Once trust is broken, especially inside the organization, it is very hard to rebuild, and it impacts culture, retention, and brand equity. So, Partha, let's talk about the privacy risk across life cycle. What is your take on it?
Yeah, again, a very fundamental question. And to apply the first principles, I would say is all the an optimum way to kind of approach it would be to take a very process view on this, and then to see, okay, in this particular process, this is the personal data that is being processed or is being collected or is being used or is being shared. Now let's take the sourcing process for that matter. What are the channels through which a job applicant would apply to an organization? Is it through a recruitment consultant, or is it through a job referral board, or is it through an employee referral, or is that the person is just applying to the on the career portals, right? So different channels would have their own mechanisms to kind of collect personal information, and obviously HR would then process such information. But more fundamentally is that, is there a set template to process such information? Is that anyone can upload any kind of a resumes, or are there certain templatized fields? These days there are, because obviously all of the ATS enabled resume tracking tools will already have it. But then the question sets in as to what personal data is indeed required in order to assess the suitability of a particular job applicant for a particular requirement, right? And that's where principles of proportionality, necessity, and legality would set in, wherein there is also an angle of employment law as to what can indeed be collected legitimately, or what is lawful and what cannot be collected. And of course, as we proceed, we would find that there are different other processes and sub-processes. For instance, it could be the onboarding process, if the onboarding is happening. And these days, there, to provide those, there are pre-onboarding things where it can happen even virtually, or there could be a chatbot kind of providing that employee experience to day one of the onboarding, where a lot more information could be captured, right, by the in-house HR team, or it could be someone who could be even be outsourced, or by the subcontractors who could be then kind of collating that information. But fundamental ground rules remain the same, and they would be ensuring that, and those would be to ensure that the personal data which is collected is processed in a manner where the employee would expect them to be processed, right? So of course, it's one thing to say we process such information in a privacy notice or in a candidate privacy notice. Another thing is to be able to really enforce them. And that's where the say-do ratio comes in. I use it, the say-do ratio, in terms of, okay, what organizations say, are they really doing it that way? And it can only be done if whatever is being said is said in a transparent manner without the legalese. And of course, the India DPDP Act also kind of says that, the consent notices would have to be provided in a clear, understandable manner. And that's where essentially the aspect of transparency will set in, because if it is too legalese, people would not understand, they do not care about it. For them, it's about the job. But it's wrong to assume that people don't care, right? It is that as to how innovatively those communication can be made. And it's also, I think, quite a good idea to be able to look at those dimensions from a communication perspective as to what could be, because that's the communication that an organization does to the individual. And after the individual onboards the company, there are various other aspects of employment in terms of their performance management, compensation benefits, grievance redressal, whistleblower mechanisms, or transfers or secondments to other companies if that's a global one, right? And many of these are also dependent on the scale of operations of the company, the sector that they are, and the jurisdiction in which they are regulated. But fundamentally, all throughout, I think privacy remains sacrosanct, and it will continue to be a very important area. It will certainly get complex. It is complex. But I think if applying the fundamental principles of privacy and putting together a governance framework around it becomes extremely important to, as you rightly said, to understand what are those blind spots. Sometimes sharing emails with an Excel sheet, right, which might have certain hidden tabs and might have employee data, may not be the right way. Or a better way would be to probably upload them in a SharePoint portal, which is access controlled and restricted. So yeah, that is one thing. Of course, with the preponderance of WhatsApp and communication channels and Teams and Slacks, in one hand, they have eased communication. On the other hand, they've also opened up the complexity, or kind of aggravated the complexity as to where all such information could be. But there are, of course, the tools and those policies which could ensure that such information is deleted after a set retention period. I've seen enterprises doing that, or at least that the retention period is indeed enforced. And one more important thing, Dr. Sahu, which I wanted to bring is we all work in emails day in and day out. And therefore, email management having to have clear segregation of what are the personal emails and what are the business emails would have to be is an important step, I believe, to be able to manage the personal data, because one's own personal data, because employees have a reasonable right of privacy even when working in the workplace environment. Of course, that might differ jurisdiction to jurisdiction and on the employee's email usage policy or the acceptable usage policy. But I think that, as we call it, the data hygiene, to be able to separate the personal data, one's salary slips, one's important information, bank statements, transactions, and then to be able to ensure that those emails are in the control of the employee even after the employee has left the organization. So those emails are being asked to be deleted by the employee, and so on and so forth. Working with contractors or working with vendor partners, be it a recruitment consultant or be it a background check verification agency or a SaaS provider providing a hosted cloud environment, becomes extremely important. And it's not, again, doing a checklist oriented kind of a thing. The checklists are there in plenty, but I think more importantly is to be able to understand what is the objective that is required to be met, right? And if the objective is, so a vendor is providing an AI chatbot feature which will be integrated in the HR's domain, which to ease the operational usage of HR or to improve HR efficiency, that's one thing. But it has to be again seen from the lenses of privacy as to, in such kind of processing, how are the elements of fairness, bias, hallucinations, false positive, false negatives are all taken care of, so that there is an element of human touch and the employee is not negatively impacted by such decisions. So,
Great.
Those are some of the things that I could think of.
Thank you. Then in the employment phase or the employee life cycle, let's say you touch upon the onboarding to offboarding, there are continuous monitoring tools and performance data you talk about, and also even location tracking apps, raise ethical and privacy questions. Our employees are aware of what is being collected, or is it proportional?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem to solve, but an interesting problem indeed. And I would say that it also depends again on the context. With remote working now kind of possible, employers, I do believe, I'm not a lawyer, but I do believe that the legal experts would have to be consulted as to what could be the extent or the permissibility of such location tracking, because if the company is kind of paying an employee to work for X hours, and if the productivity is at stake, of course, they might say that it is in the legitimate interest that one has to be kind of monitoring such employees from which location or what is it. But then there is a question of also a reasonable expectation of privacy. Is it a systematic monitoring, or is it a monitoring during those defined work hours? And what do we do? And being transparent about such monitoring rather than doing covert monitoring, unless it is for fraud investigation or for some other legal reason where certainly that kind of a transparency may not be provided. But more often than not, it is also a question of balancing the legitimate interest of the employer vis-a-vis the fundamental rights and freedom of the individual, right? And therein lies the ability to be able to strike that balance, right? It may not always be something which is kind of the most perfect solution, and I don't believe there is any perfect solution. It has to be something which is workable, because if it is too privacy tight a solution, in my view, the organization interest might be hampered. But at the same time, if the same objective is being met, take for example data loss prevention, right? DLP tools, right? Most of them are being intended to kind of really protect the employer, from corporate espionage, or protecting their intellectual property rights, or protecting their client confidentiality. So it depends on whether the DLP is being implemented in a reactive or in a proactive mode, or is a DLP enabled when certain keywords, depending on the DLP rule engine, and if those documents are sent out, obviously there is a flag message and the employee is cautioned and to kind of not send those documents, or to prevent those documents, or on the last working day of the employee, I think, or when the employee has kind of decided to move on and serving the notice period, talking from an India perspective, of course, to be able to enable those DLP. So it all depends, and there are different combinations and permutations possible. And I think that's where the data privacy team, the HR team, the InfoSec team, the governance team, and the relevant experts would have to be taken into confidence and to be able to deploy such practices using a policy which is definitely taking into consideration the interest of all parties concerned and a balanced interest in this case, right? But one has to be aware that it's not a perfect solution, but of course things can go wrong. One has to be prepared for things if they go wrong, and then build those mechanisms to be able to correct those as we go ahead. And
Great.
well, it's
No,
a
great.
it's a good
Yeah.
it's a complex thing, and privacy professionals, including me, I've also struggled with these kind of issues. But I think it's trial and error, and obviously it has
Yeah.
to be fine-grained. It has to be consulted in Europe. I'm aware of that. Before implementing, one has to consult the Works Council and taking the user in confidence. See, who wouldn't want to be doing those things, right? If the user themselves are being taken into confidence, correct?
Yeah.
So I think it is doable. It's not impossible.
Yeah. So, Partha, I request you to give a agnostic view of the regulatory landscape. Let's say we'll talk about regulation globally. We are seeing stricter laws. Let it be GDPR or CCPA now, CPRA, or let's say India's DPDP Act, right, and other emerging privacy law coming up in Asia Pacific, Middle East, as well as in Latin America. So, what is your take on it? Can you give us a regulatory landscape in a very agnostic view?
Yeah, so quite regulatory agnostic view. My sense on that would be that, again, the fundamental privacy principles of lawfulness, purpose limitation, storage limitation, transparency, cross-border mechanisms, whatever needs are there in appropriate jurisdictions would have to be kept into consideration. But fundamentally, again, questioning the what, why, and how, right? I think less is the what and why. How is also important, but I think these are. But the way I look at it is that what personal data are we really using, right? Because obviously data is data, right? If it is collected even in the United Arab Emirates, and are we collecting here? And then understanding why are we collecting this information, right? If collecting health information is, or example, collecting dependence information might be required because in order to provide the health insurance, right? And collecting religion information might be required. And I'm aware of an organization, which I've kind of consulted in the past, is also about, in Northern Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, there are these regulations which will require certain organizations above a certain limit to be able to capture the religion information because they are required to provide it to the relevant authorities, right? In the UK, one has to provide the tax information to the HMRC and all of that, right? So there are legal obligations at the same time. So understanding the what and the why remain the fundamental principles of to understand is the data when collected for the rightful purposes, and then understand, okay, are there any restrictions or are there any limitations? And if there are any limitations, what could be the alternatives, right, to be able to process such personal data, right? From an India DPDP perspective, I think it's also pretty clear that my reading on that has been that consent and legitimate use has been the two legal bases. Of course, GDPR has got many more legal bases in terms of it. We will have to probably see how the rules kind of also understand. My sense on this is that, again, my personal view is that too heavy reliance on consent in an employer-employee relationship is also putting the burden on the individual rather than making life easier, right? Because there is obviously a power asymmetry, right? Under the EDPD, employees are considered to be vulnerable because there is a power imbalance. Think of it. I can't say no to a certain thing, and that consent is not informed, not unconditional. India DPDP says it should be unconditional, correct? So I think we'll have to really see as to where are those instances where consent indeed can be deployed, and which are those situations under which consent may not be the right purpose. Because if one has to do fraud investigation or corporate investigations, in my view, those are not the areas where consent would be the best option, right? And I'm again saying this not from a perspective of a particular regulation perspective. Of course, that's important, but to be able to look at it more from a feasibility perspective and to be able to understand that, okay, what is something which can help organization at the same time provide users. And we have to also keep in consideration consent fatigue. After some point, there is a consent fatigue.
Yeah.
And the moment we give the consent, individuals also have the right to revoke the consent. So one has to also understand what are the implications of that onto the HR. Can they stop the processing, correct? And really does revoking the consent help the individual also to kind of stay in control, because the individual might need. So things have to be thought about, whether it is a granular consent, and if the consent, it has to be timed for a specific time limit. India DPDP has a provision for ensuring that the consent notices be provided in all the languages as per the constitutional requirements. And so I think those are good things, but operationalizing them from a feasibility perspective and making them sustainable is something that is a work in progress, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Partha. Even if an organization is not operating out of Europe or California or let's say India, but these frameworks are actually a gold standard, and regulators are very clear. Employee data is personal data and subject to the same rights and protection. So, Partha, let's get into the common blind spot organization normally overlook. Can you share some light on it? Yeah.
Again, maybe the fundamental
you can give one blind spot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One blind spot which I could say is, okay, see, people move within organizations also, right? So there could be a movement within the HR team, and someone in the HR team could move from the recruitment to some other department. Can move, right? People have. And I think that's where the fundamental principles of having well thought of policies in terms of access control policies, access provisioning versus revocation, right? From the HR team members themselves and their subcontractors as to who can access what in which context and for how long, correct?
Yeah.
How such information is being stored, and of course, revisiting those vendor partners who are providing those solutions, because things may change, right? And that's in jiffy. It's one thing to do a vendor audit annually and to have well-oiled contractual safeguards, which is very well appreciated and required as well. But then the ability to be able to audit those vendor partners, right? And SaaS vendor partners may not always provide that flexibility, because they might say, I'll just give you a SOC 2 compliant, type 2 compliant privacy, and here is it, and have a look at it. That is one way to look at it. But the other way to be able to is to question the practices and to be able to be a constant lookout of the any practices from the vendor partner side which could emerge. We have seen histories replete with examples where vendor partners systems have compromised the internal privacy posture of enterprises, right? And that's common across jurisdictions, right? So one is the human oversight, and also to ensure that the governance mechanism has been built, right? Having played the role of a DPO in my earlier roles and having experienced that, I've always seen the central privacy team, or even whatever the privacy structure, will do the job and is expected to do the job, but it's humanly impossible for them to be doing that activity all throughout. And that's where HR professionals who are trained in such privacy aspects also need to be the ears and eyes on the ground, and of course be able to kind of proactively detect those things and bring those to the attention of the privacy and the data governance and the InfoSec team, and highlight those things. And whenever there are new changes in the process or in the process design, I think it's very, very important to kind of really let them pass the privacy.
So sorry to interrupt. Let's say there is also, you talk about a little bit on the vendor risk. Think about the background check companies, benefit platforms, third-party HRMS tools, right? How well are they protecting employee data?
See, I sense that fundamentally by now, since onset of GDPR and various other regulations, it is not a it's not something that they are not aware of, right? Everyone has good intentions. It's also, the question is exactly as to how well are those controls operating in real time, right? Now, when you talk about a background check agency, they may themselves outsource those to various other subcontractors down the chain. And first of all, are they doing those reliability tests for their vendors as to what are they, and what are those controls that they have in place to ensure that there is a reliability of their personnel on the ground, right? Are they able, if they're operating out, not just out of Europe, out of any places, right? Are they ensuring that the data that they are collecting is actually in controlled environment, right? Or is it just floating around in WhatsApp messages all throughout, right, of their
Yes.
subcontractors? And when the data has to be deleted, it is indeed deleted, right? So we might have a right to delete clause in the contract, but how is it going to be enforced down the supply chain ecosystem is extremely important. And that's where maybe providing some kind of an attestation that data has indeed been deleted once it is no longer required, or of course, because excessive data retention, we all know, it also is a prime cause or a honeypot for kind of cyber breaches. So I think those techniques and those process controls should help. But more importantly is to be able to transparent. A vendor will gain the trust if they are transparent that there is a potential breach, rather than the data controller or the data fiduciary chasing them, correct? And I think that's an element of gaining the trust. Far too often it is, many a times it could be reactive, but think about a situation where the vendor proactively says, okay, and now we are going to also ensure. So I think that's where essentially it is important. And to be able to learn from those incidents. One thing is to have an incident management process in place in the HR process. But what happens after an incident? There are certain learnings which need to be plowed back into the learning programs, into the of not just HR but across the organization, and that's the job of the data privacy team, the learning and development team, to be able to kind of bring out those nudges, of course, in a manner which is understandable. And one of the earlier experiences that I've had is obviously people talk about awareness, but awareness has to be situation-based, context-based. So it is situational awareness, which has to be brought out in a
I couldn't agree more, Partha. We have 2 minutes to go. We have few sensitive topic to address. So absolutely well said. Data that is no longer necessary is liability, not an asset. So let's talk about it on the best practices for organization, Partha, quickly.
I think the best practices of the organization would be to ensure that the fundamentals of, again, data privacy are baked in the process as a matter of privacy by design and by default. Right now, this is not just a catchphrase; it has to be seriously implemented. Just like organizations have employee code of practice, there has to be a privacy code of practice, in my view, and many companies have done it as to this is how we process. So it could be an HR manual stating the standard operating procedures as to these are the steps. One thing is that, and more importantly, is to be able to gain the trust of the HR and CHROs to be able to set the tone at the top, right? Because that's, again, extremely important, because they need to view privacy as an enabler. But then that puts the onus back on data privacy professionals to also gain that trust. And I think that is a two-way street as to how do we ensure that HR programs are successful by baking in that. And of course, ensuring that the governance mechanism is built in cross-functionally, and we have that strategic oversight through full-fledged and well-oiled and well-thought-of privacy program, which consists of senior leadership who are cognizant of privacy risk. And it all has a structure. It can even lead up to the board level. And the DPO is considered and given the resources to be able to manage the program in a manner which kinds of provides the DPO some headroom to be able to manage those risks well in consultation with other stakeholders. Absolutely. So that's my take on it.
Also having a data classification or retention policy, also choosing vendors with, let's say, strong privacy, SLAs, right? And I can also see keeping transparency at the core, informing employees about what data is collected, how it is used, and their rights, and how it is processed, right? Partha, I mean, we are at top of the hour. Culture, trust, and responsibility, right? So rightly, I think we all know that privacy is not a checkbox, right? It's a cultural shift, right? When organizations that protect employee data well tend to earn greater loyalty, engagement, and trust. And as a leaders, we must champion privacy, not just for compliance, but because it's the right thing to do. So respect for data is respect for people, or respect for the employee. So what is your closing remark, Partha? Thank you very much for joining. It's a wonderful insight. It's almost 30 minutes now. So everyone who joined, thank you. Let's continue building cultures where privacy and empathy go in hand. And Partha, I want to understand your closing remarks.
Yeah, I think it's a privacy is a trust enabler. It should not be seen
Yeah,
as merely something which is a compliance issue, but something should be seen as a strategic and a business differentiator. But more
yeah,
importantly, it is certainly hard work to be put in. It doesn't happen overnight. It is iterative in process, and it's also
yeah,
kind of a social issue. So obviously, the cultural issues would have to be kept into consideration because what might work in one environment may not work in other environment. So at the end of the day, I think it's hope. It's I'm very optimistic as a privacy practitioner that those
yeah,
things are extremely important. But yes, trust, fairness, and using data ethically. Ethics is a very loaded term,
mm,
but I think it's the right way to go about it because nowadays companies are looking at privacy also from an ESG perspective, right? So it's a very
yeah,
important enabler. But yes, of course, these are some things. But do the fundamentals right, get the processes right, ensuring that there is tools are definitely okay, but tools without a proper thinking about the process as to how they would be sustained and all of that, and then the governance
mm-hmm.
mechanism and the ability to quickly recover from incidents and be ready for it because incidents would happen and breaches will happen. It is a question of when does it happen, and that's where the controls that have to be put in from a privacy and security perspective become extremely important. So yes, and I think those are my closing thoughts on this topic. And of course, in an
Thank you.
evolving area, it is extremely important that we stay updated with the regulatory developments.
Absolutely. Thank you,
Thank you.
Partha. Thank you very much for time.
Thank you.
And friends, colleagues, those who are watching, drop your thoughts and questions in the comment. We'll be happy to engage you there after this session.
Thank you so much.
And if you found this value in the session, please share it forward, reach out to us to know more about what you are doing at